The desert morning rose with a brittle stillness, the kind that made a man feel like even his own heartbeat was too loud. Thomas Avery stirred the embers of his small campfire, careful not to waste a single stick of mesquite. The fire was not for warmth. Night had already surrendered to the coming blaze of another merciless day, but for comfort, for the illusion that there was still something tame and human in a land that seemed to resent both. He poured the last of his coffee grounds into a tin cup, let them swirl in the water, and drank it bitter. His lips were dry and cracked. He had been out here for days searching for a stray portion of his herd, and though he knew the risk of venturing so far from his ranch, there was no other choice. Cattle meant life, and without them, he would not last another season. He stood, brushing the dust from his trousers, and looked out over the expanse of red earth that stretched to the horizon. The land undulated in soft dunes and jagged outcroppings of sandstone, the color of old blood. Far off, a vulture circled something unseen. Thomas squinted beneath the brim of his hat. The air shimmered with heat, even though it was barely past dawn. He could feel the sun rising behind him, and already his skin prickled. He had heard the rumors, everyone had. The Apache had been raiding again. Not far from San Carlos, a wagon train had been burned, and 2 ranches along the Santa Cruz had been left smoking ruins. The soldiers at Fort Bowie spoke of vengeance, of expeditions and punishment, but Thomas knew that most talk was just that, talk. The army came and went, and the desert swallowed their boots like it swallowed everything else. Out here, a man was his own law, and mercy was often a liability. Still, he had always believed that men were men, no matter what language they spoke or what flag they followed. That belief had earned him more than a few suspicious looks in town. He saddled his mule, Daisy, a stubborn gray creature who seemed perpetually unimpressed by both hardship and kindness, and began the long walk toward a narrow ravine where he thought the cattle might have gone. By noon, the sun was high, pressing down with a weight that made every breath an effort. Sweat ran in thin lines down his neck and dried before it could soak his shirt. He had only one canteen left half full, and he guarded it like gold. Water was the only real currency out here. When he reached the ravine, he found no cattle, only silence. The ground was disturbed, prints, some hooves, some human. He crouched to study them. His hand hovered over one imprint that was unmistakably not made by a boot. It was the soft, wide shape of a moccasin. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. His heart did not race, but his senses sharpened. The Apache were near. He did not run. Running made noise. Instead, he led Daisy quietly toward a stand of mesquite where there was a small spring, or at least what passed for one, a trickle of cool water seeping from between 2 rocks. He had discovered it years ago, a secret spot he'd never shared. As he approached, he could hear the faint burble, a sound that always seemed like grace in this wasteland. He bent down, filled the canteen, and let Daisy drink. Then, with the reflex of habit, he looked up. They were there, 3 of them, standing on the ridge above him, silhouettes cut against the pale sky. Apache warriors, proud and still as carved stone. Their faces were unreadable, but the glint of sunlight on the barrel of a rifle told him all he needed to know. For a long moment, no one moved. The desert itself seemed to be holding its breath. Thomas straightened, slowly capped his canteen, and set it on a rock beside him. His hand stayed well away from his rifle. "You boys thirsty?" he said, his voice rough but steady. He doubted they understood much English, but tone carried further than words. He gestured to the spring, palms open. "Ain't much, but it's yours if you want it." The one in front, tall and lean with a band tied around his forehead, tilted his head slightly. His eyes flicked toward the canteen, then back at Thomas. The other 2 remained motionless. Thomas could feel sweat trickle down his spine. He thought briefly of reaching for his gun, but he knew it would be suicide. Instead, he took a step back from the spring, then another, until he was several yards away. He raised his hands higher, showing them empty. The leader descended the ridge first, slow and cautious. The other 2 followed, rifles held low but ready. When the first reached the spring, he knelt and touched the water with his fingers as if to test it. Then he drank, deep and desperate. The others came next. One of them looked scarcely more than a boy. His face was drawn tight with exhaustion, his lips cracked worse than Thomas's own. They drank like men half dead, and Thomas watched in silence, feeling something unnameable stir in his chest, pity, perhaps, or recognition. When they had finished, the leader stood again. He wiped his mouth, turned to Thomas, and for a moment, they simply regarded each other. The man's eyes were dark and deep, like a well. Then, with a curt nod, he reached to his belt and drew a small knife. Thomas tensed, but the Apache held it out, handle first. A gesture, not of surrender, but of acknowledgement. Thomas hesitated, then took it. The blade was simple, the handle wrapped in rawhide, worn smooth by time. "Thank you," Thomas said quietly. The Apache said something in his own tongue, a series of syllables that Thomas could not understand, but the tone carried weight. Then the man turned and began climbing back up the ridge, his companions following. At the top, the leader paused, looked back once more, and then they were gone, swallowed by the horizon. Thomas stood there for a long time after, staring at the empty ridge. He felt as though something invisible had shifted in the air, something ancient and fragile. He looked down at the knife in his hand and felt its balance, the coolness of the metal. It was not a gift to be taken lightly. He tied it to his belt and whispered, "You're welcome," though the desert carried the words away before they could fall. By evening, he returned to his small ranch, the heat finally ebbing into a dusky glow. The cattle he had been searching for wandered back as if nothing had happened, as if the desert had simply borrowed them for the day. He unsaddled Daisy and let her graze, then sat on the porch with a tin plate of beans and cornbread. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and violet. The knife lay beside him on the step, catching the fading light. He thought of the men he had seen, hungry, thirsty, but proud. The newspapers in Tucson called them savages, murderers, but what kind of savage spared a man when he could have easily taken his scalp and his horse? What kind of enemy handed him a gift instead of a bullet? He thought of the soldiers who had ridden past his land weeks before, laughing, boasting that they would burn every Apache camp they found. And he wondered if those soldiers would ever understand the moment that had passed in that ravine, that quiet exchange of survival and respect. That night, he dreamed of water, cool streams and rain that fell from a sky thick with thunder. In his dream, he saw the Apache leader standing across the water, his reflection shimmering. The man lifted his hand, not in warning but in greeting. Thomas woke with the feeling that the dream had not been a dream at all, but a memory already turning to legend. The following days were uneventful, or so it seemed. He repaired a fence, mended his saddle, and traded a few hides in town. But something in the air had changed. The ranchers who usually gathered at the saloon to grumble about the Indian problem were quieter than usual. The stagecoach driver said the patrols had found an abandoned Apache camp not far from the river, but there were no signs of attack, no blood, no burned wagons. "Reckon they moved north," someone said. "Or maybe they finally gave up." Thomas said nothing. He only nodded, finished his drink, and left. On the way home, he noticed a faint trail of smoke rising from the foothills, too small for a campfire, too steady for lightning. He felt the pull of curiosity but resisted. There was a time to act and a time to let the desert hold its secrets. Weeks passed, then months. The rains came late that year, brief and angry, but they filled the spring near the ravine more than he'd seen in years. He often thought of returning there, half expecting to find the Apache waiting, but they never appeared. The knife remained by his bed, and every so often, he would take it out, sharpen it, and remember that quiet nod of understanding. It was nearly a year later when word reached him that changed everything. A detachment from Fort Bowie had been ambushed near the San Simon Valley. The soldiers had been expecting a slaughter, but instead, the Apache had withdrawn after the first volley, sparing the wounded. They had left behind a strange token, a small bundle wrapped in rawhide. Inside was a knife, nearly identical to the one Thomas carried, and a piece of cloth with a crude drawing burned into it. A man standing beside a spring, his hands open, a sun above him. When Thomas heard, his throat tightened. He said nothing to anyone. That night, he rode out alone, following the trail back to the ravine. The spring still flowed, glinting under the moonlight. He knelt there, filled his canteen, and felt the weight of the past year settle on him like the night air. He thought of the word, enemy, how easily it was spoken, how little it meant out here where thirst could kill a man faster than a bullet. He wondered if that moment by the spring had been seen, remembered, passed among the Apache like a story, or if it had been only what it seemed, a man offering water to those who needed it. He decided it did not matter. The act itself was enough. It had lived on in ways he could not see, perhaps even changed the course of something larger than himself. The war would continue, he knew that. The soldiers would fight, the tribes would resist, and the desert would outlast them all. But maybe, somewhere between the dust and the blood, a sliver of humanity had taken root. When dawn came, Thomas mounted Daisy and rode home, the rising sun painting the world gold. He felt older than his years, but lighter somehow, as though the desert had accepted him at last. As he rode, he caught sight of a lone rider far in the distance, watching him from a ridge. The figure did not move. Thomas lifted his hand in silent salute. After a moment, the rider did the same, then turned and disappeared into the vast, endless horizon. The war did not end that day, nor the next, but those who told stories years later would speak of a spring that no one could quite find anymore, and of a poor rancher who had once shared its water with his enemies. They would say that from that moment, the fighting along that stretch of desert grew less brutal, that some unseen hand had turned the tide. Whether the tale was true or not no longer mattered. The desert had its own way of keeping history, etched not in books, but in the quiet mercy of a man who had nothing left to give but water.